last 5 years, we've seen a lot of food price movements around the world, and these tend to affect people on low incomes the most. Many of them spend more than half their income on food alone. So in 2012, Oxfam GB with IDS started a 4-year project to track the impacts of food price volatility on everyday life in 10 countries. Squeezed is the first output from that research, and Squeezed finds that people are not really experiencing these food price rises as shocks anymore. Instead, it's a kind of constant pressure on everyday life, on their well-being, on the way they organise their home lives, on the work that they do, and in particular on what they eat. The research involves 3 things. One is tracking global food indicators and national food indicators for the 10 countries. Yearly return visits to 23 research sites in the 10 countries, and analysis of national survey data for each of the 10 countries to see what the bigger picture is. One year into the study, in 2012, we found that the cumulative effects of 5 years of food price rises, mostly food price rises, and the failure of wage rises to keep pace are putting quite a lot of strain on relationships, on quality of life, and on what people are eating. We found that people are not eating well, or not as well as they would like to or did in the past. We found that what you'd call famine-type behaviours are quite common and quite routine for a lot of people. A lot of people are eating less diverse, less nutritionally rich meals than they were, cutting out proteins, very common, or cutting down. We also found that people are using a lot more additives and sauces. These are cheap and widely available. They make the food a bit tasty, and the children like it. People also say that they are feeling compelled to eat food that they think is dangerous or bad in some way. The very poorest and hungriest people are cutting out meals altogether. Experts were predicting that after last year's droughts there was going to be a food price spike this year, but this is not what we found. Instead, we found that most prices for most food, except for maybe rice, had increased in the past year. And this did mean a constant pressure on family budgets. The good news is that for most people, wages did increase in the past year as well. Not for everyone, but for most people. Most people did complain, though, that their wage rises weren't keeping pace with inflation, and very few people felt that they were getting better off. The really key finding here, though, is that people are finding it harder to plan and budget, and that means that they can't save, and that means they can't aspire to better futures for themselves and their children. Home life is being affected in a number of quite negative ways, really. We see a lot more men migrating for work, we see many more women looking for paid work, and we see this is putting a lot of strain on the need to juggle work and home life. The unpaid care work that women tend to do in the households is, we find signs that more and more older women and older girls are taking on that role. For men in particular, there is they find the inability to be the breadwinner can be a real source of stress, and we've seen some cases where it's certainly leading to stress in households and fights and some violence. We find that money is becoming more important than relationships and traditional ways of life in some important ways. One is that people are finding it really hard to socialise. They find it hard to afford to go to weddings or funerals or to invite people over like they used to. We also hear that communities are becoming much more individualistic and selfish, and people don't help each other like they used to. Another thing we find is that young people have no interest in farming anymore. They say it's unreliable and unsafe, and they're often moving into other and sometimes riskier livelihoods like gold mining. People we spoke to really expect their governments to act, and they really notice when governments don't protect them against food price volatility. We think that safety nets need to be designed, the social protection system needs to be designed to take into account the effects of food price volatility and to ensure that people aren't squeezed in the way that we find them in 2012. We think in particular 4 things really need to happen. One is that governments need to be prepared for the next spike. They need to have their social protection instruments in place. You can't develop them when the spike occurs. The next thing they need to do is to monitor the situation properly, and that means keeping an eye on how people are actually eating. They need to invest in agriculture so that young people actually want to be farmers, so that there are people moving into that sector. And finally, they need to make space for poor people's voices to be heard on food policy agendas at the global level.